Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some terrifying cryptid encounters I found on the internet. In each story, the person encountering the creatures aren't quite sure what they saw, so let's see if we can figure it out for them. These stories include a girl who had something chase her up her driveway, a young man and his friends who had something growl at them on a golf course one night, and a young woman who saw something strange in the Australian bush. But first, we start with a story from a homeless man who saw a bizarre creature in the Arizona desert. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw something terrifying, so he pulled out his sword and waved it at the creature, chasing it off. Stick with me now, as this story isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. The original poster, or OP, was homeless at the time and in Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is about 15 minutes from the Mexican border by his estimation. The OP says he had been homeless for about 6 months at this point and maintained the routine of staying up all night to remain moving, which kept him warm. When the sun came up, the warm rays made it much easier to fall asleep. He would sleep a few hours before getting lunch at a local charity, take a nap at dinner, then wake up when the sun was setting and wander through the desert to remain warm until sunrise. He lays out a schedule so anyone reading his story will know he was normally awake at that time, meaning he was wide awake during his encounter, so no one would question if it was a dream, his imagination, or anything else like that. During the day as he moved about the town, he remained unarmed, but he had stashed a straight-edged sword in his burrow he had bought back when he had a job and a home. He carried the sword, which was sheathed on his back at night due to him being so far out in the desert that he couldn't see the lights from the town. He had only ever used it to carve up yucca stalks to make the roof of his burrow until that one fateful evening. The OP had been out walking about an hour and was about 5 miles or so from town and the nearest person. He was walking along a small wash, twirling a stick he had picked up when he heard the thump of something walking ahead of him within some scruffy bushes, obscuring his view of whatever it was. He didn't want to approach this thing in the event that it was something dangerous, so he smacked the nearest tree with his stick. The thumping footsteps stopped and a head poked out from behind the bush. He describes the head as having big eyes with sparse tufts of hair and looking primate-like, but almost reptilian. His first instinct was to grab his sword's handle and pull it from its sheath on its back, but it didn't quite play out like you'd see in the movies. When he yanked his sword, the strap broke and it came with the sword over his shoulder. He began brandishing it in front of him, sword still in its sheath, at the weird-looking lizard monkey creature. As he is doing so, the creature rose to its full height, which the OP estimates to be about 4 feet tall, and took off running at an alarming speed. He says it looked kind of like an ostrich the way it ran, looking more awkward than scary in its retreat. The OP says he went back to his burrow before reminiscing about the fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and corn the Salvation Army had the next day. In a comment to this story, one user asked the OP if the following description of a lizard man of the desert sounded familiar. The description is from the website OurStrangePlanet.com and reads as follows. He is maybe about 6 foot tall, very, very skinny, and it had an awkward gait, like a monkey, or a man with a disease, almost robotic. The OP responded to the comment saying that sounded very familiar to what he saw that night. He goes on to say the lighting wasn't good and he didn't get a good look at the creature, but says it was definitely a juvenile judging by the size of it. He says the only difference in what the person described on the website was that this thing had tufts of hair on top and on the side of its head. The hair, if it could be called that, was very short, scraggly, and probably too thin to even be called hair, according to the OP. I have heard of the cryptid known as Lizard Man and other reptilian beings as well, but unfortunately stories about them are hard to come by, so I was happy to have stumbled upon this one and knew I had to include it in an episode. Given the description the OP gives of the thing he saw in the desert and the description from the website backing him up that he agrees sounded just like what he saw, this certainly seems to be a humanoid reptilian cryptid. It's a good thing he had a sword with him, even if it was still in its sheath when he brandished it in front of him, but it was seemingly enough to scare this creature into running away. I will say I never thought I'd be featuring a story on this channel where a swordsman fended off a reptilian beast. Seems more like a medieval type of encounter, but when you cover enough of these stories you begin to expect anything and everything. What do you think the OP saw out in the Arizona desert that night? A lizard man, reptilian cryptid, or something else? The next story comes from northern Wisconsin, where the original poster encountered a humanoid creature in the woods outside her childhood home. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she lived in a rural area and her home was at the end of a dirt road. She also mentions that she was never afraid of the woods behind her home until that day, spending most of her childhood out there exploring. She was 14 years old when her encounter took place. Unfortunately for the OP, her parents didn't have a good marriage, which resulted in them fighting a lot. This led to her spending most of her time outside, where she says she felt more at home. When it was warm enough at night, she would take her sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack that was on her family's property. She would see bears and wolves, but was not afraid of either animal. She did not believe in the paranormal or any kind of cryptid and only got lost in the woods once when it got darker sooner than she expected. The summer she turned 14, she was home alone and had ventured down her home's long driveway to check the mail. Following behind her was her cat, who followed her everywhere, and the OP had even come to rely on him to let her know when a bear was nearby. The OP made it to the mailbox, but soon heard movement behind her and knew something was in the trees across the road. She assumed it was a deer because they were everywhere in the area she lived, but then a loud crash caught her attention and she knew something very big was moving through the brush. She describes her next actions being like those of the characters in every classic horror movie, with no thought that what she was hearing might be something she didn't want to encounter. So she tucked the mail under her arm and ventured toward where she heard the sounds, her cat close in tow. She made it no more than 10 yards into the trees when she noticed there was no noise whatsoever. Everything on that beautiful June day was completely still. No birds singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. There was absolutely no sound. Almost simultaneously to her noticing there was no sound, that eerie feeling of being watched came over her. She stopped and scanned the trees for deer, and that's when she spotted two brown furry legs partially concealed by the branches. She relaxed, but then her cat started hissing. When she looked down at him, she noticed he had his back arched while hissing and looking at the same thing she was. She looked back at the legs just in time to see them move, but they didn't move like that of a deer. Instead, they moved like a human's would when walking. She wasted no time springing into action, dropping the mail and picking up her cat by the scruff before running. And to her horror, whatever was in the brush started running after her. She says she has never run that fast in her entire life. She sprinted up the driveway into her house and locked the door. She grabbed the phone and called her neighbor, who was an ex-police chief, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He went out to the spot and searched but found nothing. The OP was hysterical at this point, so her neighbor stayed with her until her mother came to pick her up. Both her mother and the neighbor thought she was completely delusional, but the OP says she knows what she saw, and the terror she felt. It was broad daylight out, so there was no mistaking the legs. She ends her post by saying she never felt safe in those woods again and stopped sleeping outside. In a couple of edits to her original post, she shares further information about the creature's legs and some of the details in her story. She starts by saying she thought she was looking at the front legs of a deer, and only when they took a step did she realize they were much too thick and human-like, only with fur, to be that of a deer. She also noticed then that there were only 2 legs and not 4. She also says she realized for it to be concealed by the tree branches, it had to be way too tall to be a deer. Everything from her seeing the legs to realizing these two things happened in a matter of seconds. In her second edit, she says she was a calm, rational child and her parents always knew when she slept outside. Her parents, and her siblings sometimes slept outside as a family to watch meteor showers. On the off chance she actually did encounter a wild animal, her father would always ask if she made a lot of noise, then told her good when she said she did. Usually, when you make a lot of noise in the woods when near wild animals, it deters them from wanting to interact with you and normally scares them off. That's what is taught anyway. She also notes that she had her neighbor's phone number for emergencies, and this was the only time she had called him. She says she felt like a fool when her mother, neighbor, and later her father looked at her like they didn't believe her. She adds that never once had her internal alarms gone off in those woods before her encounter. She ends by saying she knew absolutely without a doubt when she was looking at this thing that she was prey and she ran for her life. I couldn't imagine the terror this poor girl felt when she saw those two legs, which she initially thought was a deer, start walking like they belonged to something accustomed to walking on two legs. And then to be chased up her driveway? It's said that some of these creatures will give chase if you run and that you shouldn't run from them. But try telling that to a terrified 14-year-old girl. Actually, I can't say I wouldn't run either should I encounter something that made me feel like I was its prey, like she said she did. I don't blame her one bit for grabbing her cat and getting out of there. I'm just glad she made it safely back to her house. I've often said it's such a shame when these creatures rob us of something we love, such as hunting, hiking and camping, or just being outdoors in the woods or otherwise. And this is exactly what happened here. The OP really seemed to enjoy exploring the woods around her home. It was her escape, and this thing robbed her of that. Again, I can't say that I blame her for not wanting to go back out there. I probably wouldn't either. But without a more detailed description, I can't say for sure that's what it was. But for two fur-covered legs to start walking in a human-like way, points to Sasquatch for me. But given that her story takes place in northern Wisconsin and there have been a lot of dogman stories in that state and the neighboring states, I can't completely rule out the possibility of that either. Also, she says she thought the legs belonged to a deer, and this makes me think the creature had hooves, which could point to this thing being a goat man. They are often said to have hooves. However, she doesn't mention the feet, but given she thought it was a deer, it makes me think it could have had hooves. What do you think this was? And would you have run from this thing too? The next story comes from a poster who was chased off a golf course late one night. The original poster does not say where exactly he lives, just that he is in New York, approximately 30 minutes from New York City. There are coyotes, foxes, raccoons, skunks, and on rare occasions black bear in the area where he lives. There was a spot on a golf course in the town he lives in where he and his friend group would go to drink and smoke. The spot was surrounded by a thick, lush forest. The night of his encounter, the OP arrived with his friends to their normal hangout spot. As they walked down a cart path to reach the spot, they heard a horrifying, deep, distorted growl come from beyond the tree line near where they were walking. The growl was followed by the snapping of saplings being broken in half. The group froze and started asking each other, "Did you hear that? And what was that?" before deciding to get out of there. The OP says that as he and his friends speedwalked back down the cart path, he felt like he was being watched the entire way and kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see a huge creature chasing them. When they reached the car, they got out of there in a hurry. They never saw anything, but whatever growled at them that night shook them to their very core. The OP then goes on to say that the growl did not sound like any of the previously mentioned animals that can normally be found in the area. He immediately dismisses the possibility it could have been a coyote because they have a high-pitched yelp and howl. He has heard them his entire life and knows it wasn't a coyote. He also knows it couldn't have been a fox or a raccoon, even though their cries can sound creepy. He says it could have been a bear due to the deepness of the growl and the breaking of the trees, but they are incredibly rare in the area. Plus, the growl did not sound exactly like a bear, or any other real animal for that matter, according to the OP. He goes on to say that it sounded like a wolf growl that someone used audio software to make the pitch rise then fall to an impossibly deep tone, distorting it to make it sound garbled and strange to the point it sounded almost digital. He ends his post by saying he wants it to just be a bear before adding in an edit that everyone who was there that night has had some sort of creepy, unexplainable experience out there on multiple occasions, and that there is something strange happening on that golf course at night. When I first read this post, I was thinking Sasquatch until he said it sounded like a wolf's growl. The growl and breaking of trees fits with a Sasquatch, but there have been a number of dogman sightings in New York. The thing that makes me think this was no normal animal is how distorted the OP says it sounded, and the fact he says it almost sounded like an audio clip. That makes me think it could have been a Wendigo. They are expert mimics, and their recreations of voices and sounds are said to sound distorted and like audio recordings. I believe him when he says there is something strange happening on that golf course, being that there have been multiple people having multiple weird experiences out there. I don't think I'd be going back out to that golf course at night and would find a new hangout spot. With the details from the story I mentioned, I definitely think this is some sort of cryptid. But the real mystery is which one? What do you think is lurking on that golf course? The final story of this episode comes to us from Australia, where a poster encounters something while out in the bush that terrified her and made her run for her life. Her encounter took place in the Blue Mountains, which is located in New South Wales, Australia. The range is considered part of the western outskirts of the Greater Sydney area. It covers a total area of 11,400 square kilometers, or 4,401 square miles, and reaches an elevation of 1,189 meters, or 3,901 feet. The original poster enjoys bushwalking, a hobby she picked up during childhood when she would go out with her father that she continues to this day. Sometimes when she ventures out for shorter walks, she will go alone. She says she knows this is dangerous and recognizes the additional dangers of being a woman out in the wilderness alone, but always carries knives with her, as well as a satellite phone. She loves and craves being out in the bush, completely surrounded by it. She posted her encounter 5 years after it happened. The OP decided she wanted to do an overnighter by herself in the bush, an idea she now recognizes as a bad one. Her walk started out normal and everything was going fine. She even passed 3 or 4 groups of people heading in the opposite direction she was. As dusk approached, she picked out a spot where she would spend the night and set up her one-person tent. She notes that she was about 30 meters from the trail. The spot she picked was behind some trees and other vegetation and mostly concealed. As she drifted to sleep, she listened to the normal wildlife sounds. However, there was another sound accompanying them that caught her attention. She describes it as a bounding sound and says it sounded like someone was sprinting through the bush right past where she was. But whatever it was ran by entirely too fast and covered too great a distance in too few many strides to be a person. She adds that once you leave the trail in the Australian bush, there is very little uncovered ground to walk normally on, much less run on at such high speeds. You have to wade through it according to the OP, so it was improbable that someone was out there running around through it like that. Hearing whatever was out there made her feel uneasy, but she dismissed the feeling. When she awoke the next morning, she ate, packed her things, and made her way back to the trail, where she began walking. She passed a few people before finding herself alone again for about half an hour. That's when she heard a stick snap off the trail to her left, breaking as if someone had stepped on it. She turned and scanned the area before seeing something that almost made her, in her words, die on her feet. There was a creature standing a good distance off the trail just staring at her. She tried telling herself it was a person, but knew deep down it couldn't be. She says she couldn't quite judge how tall this being was, but that she'd guess it was somewhere around 9 feet in height. Its skin was a dark gray or brownish color, and its head was horrifically large, she says, with 2 huge black eyes. She could not see this thing's mouth, but says its arms and legs were extraordinarily long. She froze, standing there looking at this creature with tears welling up in her eyes. She almost cried as she stood there, feeling like her legs were locked in their current position. A sense of dread came over her, and the longer she and the creature stared at each other, the more intense it became. She says she has never felt anything like it before. The fear continued building until she says she could see her heartbeat in her veins. That's when she knew it was time to get out of there, so she ran, sprinting down the trail away from this being. Tears were streaming down her face as she ran, too afraid to look back. She did not stop running until she caught up with another group that was going the same way she was. They took one look at her and immediately started asking if she was all right. She told them she had seen something and asked if she could walk with them the rest of the way, which they agreed to let her do. She ends her post by saying it took her 6 months to start going bushwalking again, but she never goes alone and you couldn't pay her to. At the very end of her post, she posted a short summary for those who found her story too long to read, saying she saw what was probably an alien in the Australian bush. She posted an edit after this saying she called it an alien because it didn't have any fur from what she could tell, and it was too lanky and thin to be a giant mammal or something similar. She says it looked like a human who had been stretched out, with an enlarged head and eyes, and that the proportions of the body looked too off to be a human, especially the length of the arms. When I first heard this story, I thought this could be a crawler. After reading it, I remembered doing some crawler stories from Australia where a girl was followed from home to home by such a creature, and I'm thinking this is what the OP in this story encountered as well. It would certainly seem that way based on the physical description of the being. The speed and swiftness with which she said this thing moved also points to this thing being a crawler. However, the height she mentions it standing at, being 9 feet tall, doesn't really fit with a crawler. They are usually said to be anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall. That's the only thing about this story that has me a bit puzzled. I mean, we know next to nothing about any cryptid except what we've heard in these encounter stories, so it could be possible for crawlers to be taller than that normal height range. Or perhaps the OP did see an actual alien in the Australian bush. What do you think she saw staring at her out there that day? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.